Hi, friends. Welcome to the Wednesday LiveStream from Dulcimer Crossing. Dulcimer Crossing is a site which is dedicated to helping you bridge the gap between what you know and where you want your music to grow. And today I'm going to respond. This is going to interrupt our Celtic month for just a moment because I think this is an important question that people sometimes have asked and wondered about. And I want to address that question. And that is, what happens if I have a smaller hammer dulcimer? Um, what has become the standard now is a 1615 or a 1514. It's really rarer for people to have smaller dulcimers. When I started playing, I did, and I'm going to show you that. And we're going to talk about that and how you can use the instruction that anybody anywhere has for you to work with the size of your dulcimer. So let's turn my camera over to my smaller hammer dulcimer. This is the first dulcimer that I owned. It's the first, and it's one I built. And this is, it's called Elise. I was back when I was naming my instruments, which I have not always done. I have not continued the process because they end up being like workhorses, and I just haven't named my workhorses. But we're gonna compare this one. You can see it sitting on top of my 650 from Dusty Strings. This was made from a kit from the Hughes Dulcimer Company that was in Denver, Colorado. And I'm moving my microphone. I'm going to have to stand up to play this one. But as we count, you can notice a couple of things about this one. I've had to rebuild it several times. That's the first thing. And so in the rebuilding, I've done some modifications. But what it has is the same outside rails, that what would be called the equivalent of a nut, tuning pins, hitch pins, bridges. These are individual Chessman bridges, which means the only thing that connects them all is this brass rod. That helps keep sustain going, which is why some people have changed that and broken these up with pieces of Delrin in their design. Now, I count the same way to figure out what's the size of the instrument: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So I have 12 from bottom to top on this treble bridge. On the bass bridge, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So this would be called a 12-11. And 12-11 instruments are still laid out the same way that larger instruments are, or smaller instruments. Some people make there's one, a traveler. I've seen two different builders of those kinds of things that are like a 9/8. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so they would be about this big. What they have in common is almost always the string that's on the bass bridge that's the lowest is a pitch that's going to be common. Now it happens in this particular instrument, that's a D. And you can see that things are a little wonky, but that's because this brass rod can go like this, and we can be in tune on one side but not in the other. And that's one of the reasons that people have started putting straight things here, because it's easier for this one to get bumped. But if I go up in my box, I've got the first D box here, but it's an octave higher. It's the same note names, but it's an octave higher than the one that's laying on the bottom underneath it. That means this is my G box, and I have a C box here, but you'll notice one of the things about the design of this one is it's one string going across, hitching back, and I broke a couple of them when I was tuning this morning. So now I have no strings in this particular place for the D and the E up here, but they would continue. So this would go from a D on the bottom to a D on the top. And because I broke these two, I decided I wasn't going to try to tune those this morning. They might need a smaller gauge string. But what I'm saying is the same box pattern that is present. This is a D box. This is a D box. This is a G box. This is a G. Nope, I'm sorry. D to D. Yep. G. Yep. So G and then A, B, C. And where am I here? That's where the high G would be. So I would be missing some of these notes up here. That means that this is where my middle C is, instead of it's the same distance from the bottom. Or actually, this is an octave higher than middle C, but it shifts things. So this is where you could get confused when you're trying to figure out how people are writing things. Several times when an instrument is this size, because we lose that top octave up here by starting with a D, this would be the G that's on my standard instrument. And you may have a smaller instrument like that where G is the bottom one here. It's the G that's the top of the bass clef, or the G that's just below middle C. My instrument was built to be D an octave higher, so it has a very music boxy kind of tone. And this is a piece of plywood. The soundboard is a piece of plywood rather than solid wood. So the tone isn't ever going to improve. It's just going to be what it is. And that's the way it was built. But here's the thing. You can note, well, let me tell you this piece of history. These are all little walnut pieces here. And let me see if I can zoom my camera in a little bit. Let's try that and see. Here we go. We're looking here. You can see that these are little triangles of walnut, and they were all the same color. And before Sam Rosetta introduced the practice of marking every four, what I did was end up pinching strings together so I could see where the fours were. And there's a little bit of a shadow, so you can't see it over here. But the final time that I rebuilt this one, I marked every fourth bridge with a permanent black marker. I tried to make it look, like it fit the instrument and that kind of a thing. But when I was rebuilding, I marked those so that I would have the visual cues that are now present on typical hammered dulcimers. And what this means is I can see where the box starts, do, re, mi, fa, cross over to the other side of do, la, sol, fa, la, ti, do. Do, ti, la, sol, fa, mi, re, do, or 1, 2, 3, 4, crossover 5, 6, 7, 8. Or this is D, E, F sharp, G, crossover A, B, C sharp, D. So that pattern is consistent regardless of the size of your instrument. So if you're looking at lessons on dulcimer crossing or any book or anywhere that people are offering instruction and your pitches don't exactly match because of where you are on your dulcimer, one of the things you can do is say, here's where, when it just asks the teacher, what's the lowest pitch you're using? And if they say I'm using a low D, on my instrument, I can be in the same place that they are because this is a D and it's my lowest D. But if my instrument was a G, I couldn't do it here. So I'd have to say, I'm sorry, I don't have that note. Can you help me understand what you're talking about in a place that I can work on? I have some students that have large instruments. They're bigger. They're 13 12s and 14 13s, different sizes, which means they came from that period before things got standardized a little bit. And their lowest pitch here is a G. So I adapt what I'm teaching, which would work for other bigger instruments, to them. And I've had to rewrite some arrangements so that they didn't have to go below G. And I normally assume that I'm going to have a D down here. A lot of hammered dulcimer teachers will assume that, but make sure you let them know that this is the size of my instrument. And then you can have you can ask for help in adjusting what's going on. But as I'm looking at like the absolute beginning series on dulcimer crossing, I may not be able to play in the same place to get note for note. But if I took whatever they're talking about between the bridges and move up to this box over here, it's the same note names, D, E, F sharp, G, D, E, F sharp, G. I can play it just an octave higher. So I can learn the same thing in a different location, which is one of the beauties of the hammered dulcimer. What I learn here, I can play an octave higher. That also means I could play it in a different box. So if they're teaching it in the D box and I don't have the low one, I can play it in my D box on the instrument here, and then later on move it to my G box and play it in G. So by pattern, this works for a lot of things. Yes, this is a 1211. And this is quite heavy. Got walnut here, 3/4 inch plywood for the back, and maple pin blocks, but it's a plywood that would keep falling apart. If you'll notice, I've got some just regular screw heads that are going in here because I got tired of these pulling up, and I just it doesn't aesthetically look nice, but it's very functional. I also put pegs in from the outside to help hold the pin blocks in rather than having them pull up and break. And so, Doug, you find that you're frustrated you don't have this lower one because yours is one that starts on the G down here, correct? Then take whatever they're talking about down there and move it over to the middle to the treble bridge. If I'd had this, this D to G, if this was a G, this would be my G box. That would make this one my D box. Now, it does take some translation, but it still works, and the principles of what happens where is all the same. So, for example, marked course to unmark is a full whole step. Unmarked to an unmark is a whole step. Unmarked to a mark is always a half step. Always, everywhere. If I keep going, whole, whole, half, whole, whole, half. And if I cross over to the other side of the mark, from mark to an unmark is whole, unmarked to a mark is a unmarked to an unmark is a whole, unmarked to a mark is a half. So whatever I learn in a pattern that fits in the box, I can move to another box. Now, you've heard me talk about modes and scale patterns in the box versus the ladder before. The ladder just determines I might have a shorter ladder. You have extension ladders and you have step ladders and you have one step stools in your house, most likely. Some of us should not be going up and down those things, even though we still have them in our house. But the size of your dulcimer will determine how many ladders you have, and that'll be fewer than the number of boxes you have because the boxes are more like that one step stool. You can fit more of them in a smaller dulcimer. But just because your dulcimer is smaller does not mean that you cannot play it and you cannot learn from the lessons that are available. You might have to do some translation. You might need to ask a couple of questions and have the instructor help you focus what it is you're working on. And that's right. Rick Thumb is right. There's only 3 notes on a hammered dulcimer. There's a marked one, there's one above, and one below. And if you look at that all the way around, it's like, oh yeah, I have, and you can start wherever you're going to count. Like here's one below, mark, one above, and this is 2 above that one, but it's 1 below that one. So if you look at your dulcimer, that's what it's going to be. And that's a helpful, anytime we can break the things down into navigable pieces, that makes it a lot easier for us to remember it, number one, and then to make use of it for our playing and learning. Having a smaller dulcimer does take away some range, but it doesn't take away. It doesn't take away. octaves are not quite in tune. I only got to tune it once before we got going today. But I can play the music on here. I may not be able to do everything that I could on a big one. Yep, that's why there are big ones. So you can do more of what you want to do. But that doesn't mean you can't do anything. And being able to do what we can do is the goal. And then finding out, I really like the size of this, but it's too dang heavy because it is built like a tank. Could probably drive over it. I remember I don't remember who it was, but there was a builder in the 80s who had an ad in Dulcimer Players News who had a fiddler. He looked a little bit like a leprechaun. He was a very small statured person, but he was playing his fiddle standing on a hammered dulcimer. And I think they were trying to emphasize the fact that their hammered dulcimers were strong. Okay, I don't recommend you stand on your hammered dulcimer. But just so you know, this hammered dulcimer is sitting on the one below it. And this is heavy for the size. The one below it is a lot bigger. And I can zoom out so you can see that. So that's, there's a lot more. The one below it is heavier, but for its size, this is very, very, very thick and meaty. So it's like a bomb shelter, yeah, for a boomer reference. That's good. So if you're looking for something that's traveling, like the Traveler hammer dulcimer, that's a 9/8, you're going to look for something that's also lighter. And it's smaller. It can fit in maybe a backpack or something like that, which can be very useful as you're practicing your hammering patterns. It may not be your optimal performance environment or instrument, but it can still be something that'll be very helpful for you as you work through things. And this also reminds me, I don't think it's available for a computer, but there are apps that are available for tablets and phones. I'm going to go look and see if I can find that. Wow. It's not showing anything right now. Maybe that it's no longer in the App Store. All that's showing up is TEF View. Any. Well, maybe those have gone by the wayside, which is very sad. But let me show you how this can be helpful. I'm going to open up mine on my tablet. Let's get here to music. I have a folder called crap I don't need. Here it is. Here is the Dusty Strings app. Let me zoom in a little bit. And I know that, Jim, I think you have this, right? This is great. You can use your earbuds or something like that. Well, actually didn't help very much, did it? Because let me make that a little smaller. The light on the pad is kind of shimmering. But you can see it looks like a Dusty Strings hammer dulcimer. Let me turn up my volume. Let's turn it all the way up. And so this D here is a typical low D, the one that's on the bass bridge, which is an octave lower than the one that this dulcimer is tuned to. And then I can change the hammer. And these are my controllers and everything. For this is the same as a Dusty Strings D550. I can turn whether I got the what kind of. There's several settings I can use here. Now I want to go back to playing. I can set this to much quieter, and use my headphones if I had my headphones connected to this, and I can play this on an airplane. And this is a way to practice when you have to be away from your dulcimer and you're not going to use a travel dulcimer. I clear. This isn't a tuning app, Doug, but I see that. This is a playing app, so you can work out hammering patterns. So I can practice two-handed things using my fingers rather than sticks. So, and the iPhone is so tiny, I just don't think that would be practical. And on a less than full size, this is not the biggest iPad, but on a less than full size iPad, I don't think it's quite as useful either. I thought this would rotate but apparently to get everything on, we have to do it in the portrait orientation. Yep. Okay. So that's an example of an app that simulates what the hammer it's sampled and it simulates what's going on in the hammer dulcimer as another way of using something smaller and working out things. So you made I remember you talking about that, but the fingertips you thought were going to be ended up being better. I think that's what I remember too. But the end result here, folks, is that a smaller hammer dulcimer is still a hammer dulcimer and can be a very useful tool in the learning and the playing of the music we want to play. So I'm never going to say to someone, you need a bigger dulcimer. I will support them if they say, I need a bigger dulcimer. Because in my experience, we should all get as large a dulcimer as we can afford, number one. Number two, transport. If you're planning to take it out of the house, you need to get something that you can move or have good roadies that can move it for you and set it up. If you're getting the large instrument that's going to stay in your house in its corner, kind of like a piano would, then you have a concert instrument in your house, and that's perfect. And you might be not interested in playing for anybody else, just for yourself or your cat or your dog or your bird or your spouse or your grandchildren or your parents. Doesn't matter who you want to play for. If you're going to be moving it around, that is a significant consideration, because the larger ones are huge. And there was the first big this size hammer dulcimer, the big one that I have here is the 650, but the 600 they had before that is on the same box. And the only person I knew who could carry it around was someone who was much taller than me. And she could carry it without lifting her shoulder, because when it just naturally, her arm went straight, it wouldn't touch the floor. But that was a function of her size. She was able to do it. I carried it and I had to lift my shoulder, and that you can only do that for so long. But I'm willing to do that because I love the tone that goes with that. But I'm also very particular about when I'm going to take it with me and when I'm going to go out. And if it's a free gig, I might take the smaller one because it's going to be less wear and tear on my body. Or when I get there, how far away is the performance place from the parking place? Which is why another reason why people get those collapsible, in Britain, it would be a trolley, a little wagon, but it's not hard shell. It's soft, and you can collapse it up and pull it behind you with your instrument and if you play with a stool or a stand or anything you're going to take with you, you can all go in there and just. I have played in hospitals where you need something like that to get things around from floor to floor, and they can fit on the elevator, all that kind of stuff. Smaller instruments are easier to port around for that. Even if they're small like this but heavy, it's still smaller space, not as wide. This is not 4 feet, and this is more than 4 feet. So when you walk, we're not used to being 4 feet from stem to stern. We're used to being, kind of this size from front to back. If we have a backpack on, that adds some that we always forget about when we turn around and whack somebody with it and didn't realize that we were taking up as much front to back space as we actually are. But for playing, yeah, shoulder straps can help with that too. And Jim, yeah, you have a soprano, which is a 16-15, but a much smaller instrument, right? Um, Sounds nice, but yeah, Rick Fogel from Wham Diddle Dulcimers, when he busks with the soprano, they listen, but they don't buy CDs. Yeah, it's easy to get to where you're playing. It's a very music boxy kind of sound, and not everybody wants that music box. The low tones. It's kind of like mandolin players who long for a mandola because everything is a little bit lower in pitch, or a mandocello. Instead of the fiddle size, which is the typical mandolin, they want a mandocello or a mandola, which move things down a fifth or a whole octave below, because that warm tone. I've heard Chris Thiele say that once. He goes, every mandolin player is looking for those bass tones. I would say the same thing about hammer dulcimer players who have a dulcimer that doesn't have the low ones. And that's one of the things I was missing in this one. It didn't have the bass tones. I would play it and people would listen. I was not trying to make a living at it. But they would listen and kind of go, oh, that's not, what is that thing? And then they'd walk away. And then, or they'd watch and say, it's kind of cool. But when I built the bigger one and it had the lower tones, I liked it. Here's the struggle with this kit, though. It's designed so that the gauge of string you use on the bottom course, let me switch cameras. The gauge of string you use here is the same gauge of string you use here. And that's why these broke. Because after this was developed, I bought this in 1982. No, 1984. 1984, yes. I bought this in 1984. And in January or February, it's for my birthday, which is beginning of February. One gauge of string goes over the whole instrument. The bigger one I built, the same thing. One gauge of string for the whole instrument, which meant, and you could hear when I was playing in here, it was pretty nice tone. When I got up here, it felt very brittle. When I got down here, it was wah wah wah. It needs a stronger, thicker gauge down here than in here, and a thinner gauge up here. And that's what builders have started doing, is matching the gauge of the string to the length of the string and what's the optimal pitch that it vibrates at when it's at that length. And so that's why new instruments have since the 90s, have started to have several different gauge strings all the way across, which helps balance the tone from bottom to top. And you don't have particular sweet spots and dead spots. This one's like an old cell phone service. It's got sweet spots in here, and it sounds like you're going to get some dropped calls. You may actually broke some strings up here, and it's going to be less than optimal in this bottom one for my instrument. That doesn't mean yours is that way. I am not a reputable builder. There are reputable builders whose instruments will have good tone all the way across. I am Steve Yulberg. I built this one from a kit in 1984. So it's the first hammer dulcimer I built. I built my mountain dulcimer before that in 1980, but my hammer dulcimer in 1984. And yeah, it's just me with my experience. That's right. You were a 1211 with a constant gauge, and you did it with loop and individual strings. Yeah. Which is, one of the things you can do. You can customize your instrument. You can customize it. And if I was customizing this, I wouldn't use screws. I would take these out and put in hitch pins so that I could use the kind of strings that Jim is talking about. And maybe that's the next variation I need to do on this instrument when I do an upgrade. And then it'll actually be across. If the tone won't change, but across the instrument, I might remove the sweet spots and have a better balanced tone across the instrument. Yes, I would have to add extra pins. Well, let's see. Because the way this one was originally laid out is I would have three strings that went over this one, and the first two would go around and come back. And can you see? See if I can zoom in and show you that. I have to move the instrument. Oh, that's heavy. Um, you can see these extra holes where I took the screws out. The first set of strings would go here. The next one would go over. Let's see. The next one would go over here and wrap around and go up and wrap around this one and come back. So that this was a three-string course instrument. There would be three strings in each course, and I converted it to two strings. And if I was going to single string, I'd double them up. I might not. I might just put a hitch pin in there, and I might have all I'd need. I'd have to do some calculating to know the answer to that for sure. But anyway, that's our time for today, and thank you for tuning in to look at smaller hammer dulcimers, which, yes, can be used with the lessons on Dulcimer Crossing or the festivals you go to. Just be aware that those kinds of things are always focused on what might be the majority of instruments. Don't feel inferior. Don't think I'm not doing something right. If you have the dulcimer you have the one you can use now, and you can always move to another one. You might trade this one in if you want something different, um, or you might have some customization made to it if you want something different. But you may not need anything different. You may need just a shift where you're playing in order for the things to work. If you have further questions, you can write to me, steve@dulcimercrossing.com. If you're a member of Dulcimer Crossing and you have those questions, submit a ticket or add your comment to the lessons as you're working through and say, how would this work on my 9/8 or my 8/7 or my how can I apply this one to that? And we'll get you your answer so you can get playing. And thank you again for your kind attention today. There is one thing I want to call your attention to. The 4 Equidistant Dulcimer Day is happening this weekend. Registration is already closed, but you can purchase a concert ticket so that you can have access to the concert. We did have a last minute substitution. Bradley is not able to be with us for illness, but Rob Brereton is going to be the other teacher that fills in for us on that day. There is a concert, a round robin concert that takes place at the end of the day. And if you are someone who is wondering where your workshop handouts are, they're coming, but we had to wait for Rob to get his to us before we put the packet on the website. If you're trying to get to that, when you've registered for the festival, you get an additional menu item at the top of the page here. Oops, I have to share so you can see what I'm talking about. In the workshop page, you click on the workshop page in the top right hand corner of the site. You can see here's the Zoom link for how we get into the website or how you join us. And at the bottom, this is where the resource packet will be made available to you once it's ready. And it's coming today. You've got that. I was so excited to have that email go out to tell you it was ready, and forgot to remind you that it might be delayed just a little bit because we have the substitution. So best laid plans. Thank you for understanding it. And I will see you next week. We'll be back on Celtic music next week. But thank you for being with us today. And if you're watching this after the fact, you can always leave comments here. Or again, like I said, write to me at Dulcimer Crossing, steve@dulcimercrossing.com. Have fun. Keep playing.